we're getting the go ahead to begin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are situated. It's morning here in Central Texas. My name is Ryan Bohl. I am a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst with RANE Intelligence. And I'm here to present to you one of our geopolitical risk monitors, which is the way that we build out scenarios in a formal, structured way to assess futures with a degree of uncertainty in which the path going ahead is not clear. We conduct these scenario building exercises to try to map out probabilities for clients, for consumers, and for folks like yourself. So without further ado, I will start in with our geopolitical risk forecast on what does the US-Saudi relationship look like through 2025. So just bear with me. I'm about to share the screen to show what this looks like. Okay, so this is what the product looks like on our website. And just to go through what we do and why we do it with a geopolitical risk monitor, or GRM, as we call it. Again, it's about expressing uncertainty, expressing multiple futures. It's about forecasting beyond our traditional forecast timelines. We typically forecast things a quarter at a time or a year at a time. And every decade, we do a decade-long forecast. So these allow us to do alternative timelines. And they also let us map out more than one possibility. We chose this one in particular because when President Joe Biden took office in January 2021, there was a degree of uncertainty as to what the US-Saudi relationship would look like through his first term. So we have some reasonable assumptions that allowed us to anchor this forecast. First, of course, President Biden is elected on a nice, clean electoral timeline. There will be an election in 2024, and there's a possibility that there will be an administration changeover then. So we anchored it with that first term in terms of our timeline, because we know that this administration won't change between then and now. We also know that the Biden administration said on the campaign trail that they were going to reframe the relationship with Saudi Arabia, conduct a strategic review, which is still underway, and even had made some kind of hawkish statements about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, saying things like we would make them an international pariah, that they might engage in new levels of sanctions that the Trump administration had not. And so that created a degree of uncertainty that was the impetus for the creation of this forecast. As we go through this, we also have some big anchored assumptions that help us build out all our alternative futures, our different scenarios. And we do have 5 of them that I'll kind of go through with you. But at the moment, some of our key drivers that we've always anchored our view of the US-Saudi relationship are the ones that wouldn't surprise anybody in here: the stability of the energy market, the confrontation with Iran, the ongoing fight against terrorism, some economic and political ties, things like the Saudi investments in the United States, and of course, the lucrative arms sales to Saudi Arabia that are important for certain Congress people and certain constituencies. Those are the anchors of that. But what we have seen over the past 10 plus years is a weakening of some of these anchors in different ways. And so these fundamental anchors of the relationship have been changing, and some of them have been weakening. And they suggest that the close relationship that the United States and Saudi Arabia has historically had, at least since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991, will be shifting, and that we will be seeing a different kind of relationship. And that's where we anchored this forecast and began it. And that actually informs our baseline scenario. So as we look through here, what we see is we're talking about a relationship which is a strained but pragmatic one that is full of the criticisms and backdoor talk and the gossip that we are seeing in reports like the Wall Street Journal this morning was talking about how Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have repeatedly refused to pick up the phone for President Biden. That's a sign of diplomatic tension that fits into our baseline forecast, the one that we consider to be the most likely going forward. And our most likely one is the one that's written here about the idea of the United States pivoting to Asia. The United States now, and this has not been updated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we will need to incorporate that, but the United States' focus on Russia, this great power competition paradigm that's emerging in Eurasia, is drawing US attention away from the Middle East. And that's one fundamental driver of the idea that the relationship won't be as close as it was in the past. And it helps inform the way that the United States behaves in other areas of the Middle East that Saudi Arabia cares about. And it explains some of the alignment kind of coming off the wheels there. We are also seeing that the energy transition is also something that's a strain on U.S.-Saudi relations. For a very long time, the United States relied on Saudi Arabia to stabilize the oil market. Well, as time goes on and as electric vehicles and other alternative energies become more normal in the U.S. economy, the need for oil from abroad will drop. The need for oil in general will drop. And therefore, the strategic impetus for a close relationship with Saudi Arabia declines. And we're already seeing some of that manifest, where the United States is attempting to get Saudi Arabia to increase oil because of the interruptions from the Ukraine invasion. But so far, they're being rebuffed. And Saudi Arabia is attempting to leverage this moment to try to remind the United States that their special relationship, if they don't have a special relationship, there could be a monetary cost to that. But that's one of the other key drivers that we see changing, is that as the United States transitions away from hydrocarbons, the relationship with Saudi Arabia will weaken. We also see, just in general, the United States pivoting out of the Middle East, not just because of China, but also because of war wariness at home. The war in Afghanistan is over with a Taliban victory. The United States is disinterested in engaging in another nation building or even a sustained military campaign in the MENA region. And we can see that already with the recent attacks on a U.S. airbase outside of Abu Dhabi at Al Dhafra. The U.S. response was not to escalate to strikes within Yemen. Rather, it was to increase its defensive posture and refrain from engaging in the Yemeni civil war. That is a reflection of the United States' reticence to get involved in yet another Middle Eastern conflict. We also see, of course, the driver towards the Iran nuclear deal, which right now there's a degree of uncertainty that's been injected by the Russians. But on the U.S. side, the U.S. determination to cut a deal with Iran on some level over its nuclear program remains strong. And that is part of the United States' interest in disengaging from the region. And of course, it's a source of tension with the Saudis, since they oppose a nuclear deal with Iran that might strengthen the Iranian economy, might embolden them to carry out new proxy attacks, might embolden them to try to destabilize Saudi Arabia, et cetera. And last but not least, the nature of terrorism has also changed. ISIS and Al Qaeda are still notable threats in their own right, but they certainly aren't the terror superpowers that they were even 5 or 6 years ago. Territorially, ISIS has been defeated. All of the regional actors are now attempting to contain and suppress it. ISIS doesn't have a state sponsor, neither does Al Qaeda, with the exception of the Taliban having an uncertain relationship with Al Qaeda. That may change some of this depending on what Al Qaeda's behavior is going forward. But these terror groups have also shifted their strategies towards the near abroad. ISIS remains focused in Yemen and Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. They're not exporting terror to the West the way that they were in the past. And without that strong driver of the threat of terror attacks in the West, the United States feels it can distance itself from some Saudi policies and not necessarily be as close of a partner as they were in the past. So while that's being said, that is our baseline scenario. We do have assumptions and things that we're watching for to see if that baseline scenario is challenged or changes. Of course, the first one is whether or not President Biden gets a second term. If we see the return of the Trump administration in 2025, we foresee a closing of this gap. The Saudis and the Trump administration had a very close personal relationship, and they did see certain things like Iran strategically eye to eye. So we could see a change from that. We could also see a strengthening of jihadist groups. If ISIS, whatever you want to call it, 2.0, 3.0, however you want to define that, if there is a new radical Islamist caliphate in some capacity that either takes territory or exports substantial amounts of terrorism to the West, we would see the United States close the gaps with the Saudis and rely on them as partners to try to help suppress both the ideological underpinnings of such a group, as well as, depending on where they're originating from, possibly security action or military action. Another factor that we're still watching with a fair bit of uncertainty is if the US-Iran nuclear deal talks completely fail and we move back into a confrontational phase between the US and Iran, that will also close the gap between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Between Saudi Arabia and the United States. They would once more see a mutual threat. And those are the areas that we're looking for going forward, whether or not we could see the relationship move back into what we saw in previous eras. Now, as we go down, we can kind of talk about these different scenarios and some of the drivers that we see going forward, and we can take a look at how our scenario likelihood breaks down. Now, you notice that there's not a great deal of change in this relationship. That's in part because our baseline assumptions haven't been challenged by very many events going forward. But we'll go through that here in a moment. Let's kind of take a look at our 5 different scenarios that we built out and why we built them out the way that we did. We have scenario A, which is the idea that there's a break between the two. Basically, the United States is done with Saudi Arabia. It's treating it like a neutral partner and or removing troops from the region. It could result in the Saudis taking their investments out of the United States. The United States is no longer buying Saudi oil at scale or is removing its security guarantees. We consider this, of course, a very unlikely scenario, but it's certainly something that we consider as a possibility that we could build up towards. So we give that a 5% right now. We also have our scenario B, which is this idea of the US and Saudi Arabia are still working together, but they're strained. But most importantly, what differentiates the scenario from our baseline is that the United States is still focused on the Middle East. So, for example, we have breakdown in the Iran nuclear talks. That's where scenario B could kick in, where even though the US and Saudi Arabia are sort of forced to work together, the US doesn't drop its criticism of Saudi Arabia's human rights. It doesn't drop its criticism of Saudi Arabia's Yemen intervention. It doesn't suddenly become more hawkish against Iran and act as a patron of potential military action against the Iranians. So there's still tension in the relationship, but because of events on the ground in the Middle East, they're drawn back together into something of an uncomfortable but closer partnership. Scenario C, which we consider a just 10%, so it's a pretty unlikely one at the moment, is that there's a mutual threat of some kind that's massive enough to bring the United States' attention back to MENA. Something on the order of a second 9/11, of the Iranians testing a nuclear weapon and becoming more aggressive towards their neighbors, potentially launching attacks into neighboring states. Something that would be large enough to destabilize the oil markets, large enough to pose a threat to the West, that would bring the United States back into a very close relationship with the Saudis and cause them to completely bury all of their criticisms of Saudi Arabia and of its leadership and of its foreign policies. So we don't see that as terribly likely at the moment, but of course we consider it a possibility. Our most likely scenario is this scenario D, which is the United States deprioritizing the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. And that has everything to do with the China front, the Russia front, and kind of what we talked about before. And then finally, we thought about the idea of, and this builds into some of the other general key forecast questions that we've asked about places like China. There is the possibility that Saudi Arabia becomes a proxy ally for the United States in a new Cold War scenario against China. Now, in our China key forecast question, we don't consider a new Cold War to be the most likely scenario, but we do consider it to be a scenario. And if it did happen, we would see the United States moving closer to Saudi Arabia to try to use the oil weapon against Beijing, to cut out Chinese defense contacts and Chinese economic influence, as the United States attempts to build an economic, iron curtain around China. So again, as we don't see that necessarily as the most likely scenario, that is something that we considered going forward. So we can kind of go through some of these and talk about how these impact different places. And as we look at scenario A, and we break this down, the way we construct these scenarios is with our implications, our assumptions, our indicators, and we start off with our assumptions. And so when we're talking about scenario A, which is, again, this is a breakdown in relations, our assumptions are things like there's a new Iran nuclear deal, but Saudi Arabia doesn't like it. The Biden administration is still focused on trying to prevent China from building up influence, and this irks the Saudis as they attempt to diversify their economic and defense influence. The U.S. focuses heavily on human rights, something that Saudi Arabia's record is not terribly great in. And they're willing to sanction over it. And that would be a pretty big change. We haven't seen a whole lot of that in US policy, but we know that the Magnitsky Act exists. We know the congressional pressure exists. So our assumption for this scenario is that they actually follow through on the rhetoric when it comes to human rights. The Saudi political establishment rallies behind Mohammed bin Salman and this nationalist or hyper-nationalist establishment that says the US can't tell us what to do. We're going to distance ourselves from the US. We'll sell our investments. We'll sell our oil to countries that they don't want us to. We'll keep the price at levels that they don't like, et cetera. But the establishment has to be united. Otherwise, that could create a fracture that the U.S. could exploit. It would probably create a shift in Saudi behavior. So the Saudi domestic scene is not only willing to absorb pressure from the United States, but to push back against it. Another one that we are assuming for this scenario to take place is the Saudi economy is solid, and that it is not in a weakened economic position where the United States has some sort of leverage over them, for example, by buying Saudi oil, and that the Saudis also have strong economic ties to China, and the Chinese are resisting U.S. sanctions pressure, or resisting cutting ties with Saudi Arabia as the U.S. carries out this kind of human rights-centered campaign against the Saudis. The Chinese are there as a backup to allow the Saudis to offset such pressure economically, and again, engage in that nationalist pushback against the US. We also see that in this scenario, the Saudis retain strong defense ties with the Chinese and the Russians, possibly including escalated defense ties, jets, missiles, advanced gear from these rivals of the United States, some of which do begin to replace the US kit that so heavily makes up the Saudi armed forces right now. And then finally, is that the Saudis start to develop their own strategic independence in the diplomatic sphere. They are developing stronger regional alliances with GCC states, so anchoring themselves on the Emiratis, of course, but potentially also on Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, making that a more coherent alliance bloc, and even normalizing with Israel, which would free up the Saudis from some American influence by giving them a new avenue for intelligence sharing, by giving them a new avenue for defense purchases. And so considering the idea that this post-American power bloc emerges is a key assumption of our scenario A. And then from there, what we then see is our implications. So what this scenario might look like for the rest of the world. And we'll start off with our geopolitical implications very quickly here. But basically, we see more sanctions on Saudi Arabia for its human rights record, which makes Western influence and transactions in Saudi Arabia more difficult. But in our assumption, the Saudis are able to offset this pressure by going to China, which means they won't change their behavior for human rights. So even as the West starts to sanction Riyadh more often, we see the Saudis pivot east so that they can continue to have the same level of economic growth as before and resist that pressure. We also see that things like harsh tools, again, that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman might be sanctioned. Other top leaders might be sanctioned and cut off from Western investments in the Western environment. And this creates a cleavage, again, between them. We see the Saudis start to move towards the Russia-China bloc, or however that emerges in the future with the fallout from the invasion of Ukraine. But Saudi Arabia's better friends are in Moscow and Beijing. Counterterrorism for the US would have to restructure beyond Saudi Arabia. They would need to have their own independent partners. They could rely on the Israelis or the Turks or local allies, or they could simply just attempt to avoid the counterterrorism issue as much as they can and see if the terrorists simply stay within the near abroad, focused on these regional governments. And then the US might not necessarily be there for Saudi Arabia if there's another Al-Qaeda uprising like there was in the early 2000s. That would be something that Saudi Arabia might have to go to another country like Israel or the United Arab Emirates to get support for. We also see that if the United States and Saudi Arabia, they have a cleavage between them, this also certainly means that Mohammed bin Salman is not only remaining in power, but he's not going anywhere. This for the Saudis to have that political will to pivot from west to east means that the Mohammed bin Salman has control of the establishment, and we see a nationalist Mohammed bin Salman vision of the country going forward. We see that the U.S. is no longer as influential in Yemen, since it will be giving up its leverage over the Saudis, and of course, and there's kind of an implication of the Emiratis here. So the Yemeni conflict will continue with or without the U.S., and the U.S. will not have the influence to stop the Saudis from carrying out the airstrikes and military maneuvers that they see fit. Regional partnerships become fractured, and we see less of an Arab NATO emerging with things like the Abraham Accords, but rather sub-regional alliances that will act independently of the United States, and again, anchored on things like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel, but those alliances act independent of the US. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't, but they certainly don't do anything that are purely in US interest. They have to have some sort of alignment to shift policy. And then, of course, we also see this potential that in the scenario of a cleavage, that the Saudis go nuclear and that they develop a civilian nuclear program with the potential of their own military nuclear program. This, of course, would be an outpouring of from one of our original assumptions that there is some sort of deal between Iran and the United States. The Saudis take a look at Iran and they say, well, they got away with it, so can we. Let's develop a nuclear program that does not hold up to the gold standard that the UAE has had. Let's make ourselves a civilian nuclear program that can weaponize if we see fit. And then that would be a response to this distancing between the US. Those are big geopolitical implications, and we do have business ones as well. I won't go through those through the sake of time so we can get to the other scenarios. But we also consider the business angle of how these scenarios impact trade relations, etc. So we then jump over to scenario B here. This is the pragmatic focus on the Middle East. And our assumptions on this one is that there is still a deal between the US and Iran, but the US does not use that deal as an excuse to move away from the region. So there's a nuclear deal. It doesn't do anything about ballistic missiles or regional proxies and things like that. But the US is still interested in combating those regional proxies. It's still interested in dissuading the Iranians from building up a ballistic missile program. And so it remains a partner with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, of course, too, to try to contain the Iranians. The second assumption that we have is that the US counterterrorism will still pretty much align with Saudi Arabia and will continue to focus on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, other groups. The US is not going to simply wash its hands of the regions, but will continue to carry out counterterrorism against these groups with regional allies like the Saudis. And another assumption is that while the US will talk a lot about human rights, it won't really follow through very often. Or if it does, it'll be symbolic, which is what we've seen up till this point. We also see that the Saudis would be building out diversification of their military and diplomatic ties, and they would be looking for partners in China and Russia, but they wouldn't cross any American red lines. This means that there's no Saudi civilian nuclear program that looks like it could weaponize. This means that the Saudis don't buy the Su-35 from the Russians or the S-400. They're not buying Chinese jets or any systems that the United States would consider sanctionable under CATSA. So the Saudis will diversify, but within American limits. The Saudi political establishment, as they continue to be nationalists behind Mohammed bin Salman, agree that the strategic defense ties with the US are important, that they don't need to push back against the US or cut ties with the US, but that they need to continue to carry out things like investments in the United States and continue to maintain stability of the oil market, not just for Saudi treasury purposes, but also to make sure that the United States' economy isn't too adversely affected. That would need to be the same for this scenario to come true. We also see the Saudis would make some symbolic progress on human rights reforms, and we've seen some of this already. You know, women being able to drive, certain activists being released. It's limited. It's certainly nothing close to democratization, but it moves the Saudis away from that harsh view of Mohammed bin Salman that emerged after the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It changes their reputation a bit. So it doesn't substantially change the political system, but it does mean some activists gain a different level of freedom. And then finally, the Saudis, sort of as they are developing their economy, they're dipping into both the West and the East. So they have, both sides sort of have leverage over the Saudis, but the Saudis also have ties with both sides. So they're not pivoting in either direction. They continue to build out in both directions as they develop their post-hydrocarbon economy. So our implications, our geopolitical implications from this, what we see is, what we see is first off, because the US is still focused on Iran and its ballistic missiles and its regional proxies, we don't see the Iranians acting as aggressively as they might with, say, scenario A, with the breakdown in US-Saudi relations. The Iranians are still concerned that they could trigger a war with the United States. The US is still engaged in some region, in some way. And so the Iranians are not as aggressive, although they will still become more aggressive post-nuclear deal. This doesn't mean that they necessarily allow a sustained rocket campaign or missile campaign against Riyadh that could cause significant damage, an escalation from what we're seeing. So the Iranians sort of have to feel that they have to hedge their bets because the US is still involved in some capacity. The US is also going to be using Saudi Arabia in this scenario to build leverage over the Russians and the Chinese. This might create friction with the Saudis, but at the same time, the relationship, that's part of the strained part of the relationship. But at the same time, the US does try to use its leverage to try to get the Saudis to limit their ties with the Russians and the Chinese. The US keeps them as a key counterterrorism bloc as well. So there will continue to be the counterterrorism that we've seen in some places between the Riyadh and Washington. And then we also talk about this idea of one of our assumptions is these these status quo strategies. Basically, that the U.S. isn't so much shifting as it's feeling strained with the Saudis, but it's carrying on what we already see today: counterterrorism, anti-Iran, oil market stability, but all of it is within certain limits. There's no maximalist strategy with the U.S. on any of these fronts. On counterterrorism and Iran, the U.S. will still be reticent to get involved in new conflicts the way that they are now. And the last implication of this is that because of the friction, the Saudis are going to continue to develop their diplomatic and military ties with rivals, as well as with alternative partners like Israel and Turkey, because they don't believe that the United States is going to stay friendly forever. This relationship sort of is kind of the calm before the storm one. They're both holding their breath to see which one's going to say, I'm breaking up with you. And so the Saudis are preparing for that day, and we continue to see diversification of those ties in both countries that are allied to the US and in some of their rivals. So then let's go on up. That's our scenario B. And we've talked about, we've already talked about scenario D, but we'll talk about scenario C, which is our mutual resurgence of threats. And of course, our assumptions on this are pretty straightforward, that the Middle East kind of falls apart. Nuclear negotiations break down and Iran becomes much more aggressive, or there's a nuclear confrontation between the US and Iran. Then the US needs to rally its regional allies, including Saudi Arabia. Jihadists also might return at scale. We see a new caliphate form territorially in a fragile state like Yemen or Iraq or Syria again, or even we see the Taliban becoming a state sponsor of terrorism that begins to carry out acts abroad. And so we see that the United States is pulled back into the region because of something like that. And then they rely on an old partner like Saudi Arabia that is mutually threatened by such groups. The relationship between them is focused on dealing with either the Iranians or the jihadists or both, this resurgence of threats. As a result, they bury other things. The US decides that they're not going to talk about human rights anymore because they need the Saudis to deal with these very real threats. And as a result of this close relationship, the Saudis sort of move away from feeling the need to develop backup relationships with US rivals like Russia and China. The US in this scenario is pouring troops into the region. It's pouring hardware into the region. It's completely dropped talk of sanctioning anybody in Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis believe that they're moving back into kind of the 90s version of their relationship, where it's very close ties. The United States is a security guarantor, and they can trust them for a long period of time. And therefore, they don't need to move very quickly with alternative relationships, so long as the US is behaving that way. And we've talked about the baseline. The US deprioritizes the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, but we can just skip quickly to our assumptions of why we believe this is the most likely one. Again, we're assuming that there will be a US-Iran nuclear deal in some capacity. We're talking about the US pivoting to Asia, now with the invasion of Ukraine, also having to pivot to Europe. We're talking about that the political environment in the US is talking less and less about the Middle East and more about major geopolitical crises in East Asia and in Europe. There isn't a jihadist resurgence of any kind. Jihadism stays localized and is unable to carry out anything more than lone wolf attacks in the West. They don't have necessarily bases of terrorism that the US could go after. And we also see that in this scenario, China continues to do what we're seeing it do. It's China's rise of building military bases in Africa, of trying to sell more and more defense gear to Gulf Arab allies, being willing to make those purchases. This is the one where we see the US's eyes just being taken away by bigger issues, and that the US is so focused on both Russia and China that it doesn't have a whole lot of bandwidth to deal with crises in the Middle East, and the Middle East is sort of left on its own. And that means that Saudi Arabia has to deal with its own security in a bigger way. And so our implications of this: Saudi Arabia will try to be building out a regional alliance and an international alliance network that's independent of the United States. Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Israel, all of them would be part of a potential either Saudi-led bloc or a Saudi-centered bloc of powers that are trying to focus on Iran, trying to focus on jihadism, and trying to fend off US pressure to cut ties with Russia and China. And so that would be an independent alliance of indigenous states that would be trying to push back against US influence and maintain their independence. We also see in this case, because of that, normalizing with Israel becomes more likely the less the United States is interested in the region. The Saudis are going to be looking for defense backup partners. They need anti-missile and anti-rocket systems, and the Israelis are very good at that. All of those defense pushes, those defense pulls, will bring Riyadh and Israel closer together. Saudi Arabia also becomes more activist in the Middle East. Without the U.S. to back it, the Saudis feel the need to interfere more with Iranian politics. They need to be more involved in Yemen. They need to fill the gap that's being created by the U.S. power vacuum with whatever defense forces and diplomatic energy that they've got. They also engage in some levels of competition with some of these other countries. And while they're trying to build up a coherent bloc with countries like Egypt and Turkey, there's also friction with them because of these national interests that mean that there's divergences of what one wants from those countries. So for example, in Iraq and Syria, the Saudis could see themselves both working with the Turks against the Iranians and working against the Turks against Turkish interests in those countries, concerned that Turkey is also trying to fill the power vacuum with their own interests. This is very 19th century, late European 19th century geopolitics here, where there are friendly states that are still competing with each other, sometimes in proxy battlefields, as they try to establish, they try to center themselves as the regional order against both friends and foes. We also see European powers becoming more interested in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly with arms sales and military support. We already saw that with the Emiratis buying some French fighter jets in December 2021. So many of these European powers start to sell more arms to the Saudis. They also get more diplomatically involved. They don't replace the United States, but they're part of the diversification that Saudi Arabia engages in an attempt to make sure that the power vacuum is filled. They also, the Saudis in this case, also start to diversify towards Europe more. Some of their investments shift over to Europe, which is of course a safe economic bet, but it also incentivizes Europe to be more interested in Saudi Arabia's security and Saudi Arabia's economic well-being because of the investment size within the country, within their countries. And then last but not least is that they are building out independent defense systems, including ballistic missiles, which we know they're already working on, but these things start to try to rival the Iranians. They start to build up systems that they can use independently of the United States. They try to build a defense supply chain. They can't be interrupted by US pressure or Western pressure or changing strategic dynamics in the Western bloc. They'll be looking more towards the Russians and the Chinese to help build up these technologies and to develop their own supply chains that can be used indigenously and used for their own national priorities. So last but not least, and then we can kind of open it up for some discussion, some Q&A, whatever you guys might like to do. We have the last but not least. This is the one that we consider one of the least likely, the strengthening the ties to Saudi Arabia, because there's a new Cold War. And this new Cold War, of course, looks very much like the old Cold War, as the Saudis were once used as an anti-communist bloc. Now Riyadh in this scenario would be used as an anti-China bloc and would be expected to engage in this new iron curtain that the US and China are drawing between one another. And the assumptions, of course, here is that the global system bifurcates into a US-China struggle. And the US is going to politicize the use of Middle Eastern oil to be both a weapon against the Chinese, as well as to increase the economic advantages of the West. There would be we would see also a significant, for this one to happen, we would also see a significant US military buildup in East Asia, potentially in fear of a Taiwan invasion or of an escalation with North Korea or any of the disputed waters in the the seas south of China. We would see US troops really redeploying out there at scale. And then the US would need its regional partners like Saudi Arabia to pick up the slack that they're leaving behind as they pivot out of the Middle East. And we would also see in this one of our assumptions here is that the Saudis, of course, don't back the Chinese and they don't do a neutral approach. They instead go straight into Washington's camp. That's where they feel comfortable. We also see another driver of this is that the Iranians would back the Chinese. And so that new Cold War would go right through the Persian or Arabian Gulf, as the case may be, right between those power blocks. And we also see another Cold War dynamic, which is that Saudi Arabia's human rights record and that human rights records of most allied countries will no longer matter. It wouldn't be congressionally salient, politically salient. It wouldn't even be salient really in media, because the US would be more focused on trying to get the the Saudis to be part of this new Cold War. And then finally, another assumption is that we need to see that Russia and China have an alternative financial system, and for the countries that ally with it, and that the Saudis then respond to that financial system by not engaging in it. They just go with the Western financial system that emerges out of the Russians and the Chinese developing this alternative to the dollarized financial system. And some of the implications of this new Cold War is, of course, what we saw in the old Cold War. The Middle East is carved up between pro and anti-China states, pro and anti-US states, with proxy battlegrounds in between. Saudi Arabia would be probably part of the big anchor for the United States. Iran would be the big anchor for China. And then other countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, currently battlegrounds between Saudi Arabia and Iran already, then also involve a US-China element as well. Saudi Arabia is no longer seen as such a transactional partner in terms of oil. Rather, it's seen as a key proxy ally. And Saudi Arabia's wars become America's wars in this scenario, because they're being seen now through the lens of anti-China maneuvers. So the Yemeni civil war, if it's infused with an anti-China element, then the United States becomes an active partner in it, much more so than we've ever seen, in order to defeat the supposed Chinese element that emerges out of this Cold War. We also have, of course, this is a very tight relationship, and the Saudis are heavily armed by the United States. The defense ties get deeper as Saudis start to develop their own indigenous defense network. It's mostly with American gear, using American supply chains, using American technology, and that's something the United States would encourage, because again, the U.S. can't be both confronting China in East Asia and also running the proxy struggles through MENA. Rather, they would rely on Saudi Arabia to build up its own military to an advanced stage, so that the U.S. can redeploy. We would also see some change in the way that the Emiratis and the Saudis talk about Islamists, which, of course, after the Arab Spring, that was a worry that those Islamists were going to topple their regimes. Instead, because there is a new Cold War, Islamists become split themselves between pro-America and pro-China camps, and might end up being more of a nuanced experience where it's more like a pro-Saudi Islamist outfit and an anti-Saudi Islamist outfit, but they would be pulled into the dynamics of this Cold War. So Islamist parties, in some cases, might be seen as more of an ally by the Saudis and by the Emiratis, who've traditionally gone after them, especially if they are more anti-China. So we'd also see that, obviously, as we mentioned before, there'd be a race for all the neutral countries: Sudan, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Libya, depending on their geopolitical states. But these countries would be proxy battlegrounds, trying to win them over to either alliance structure. We would also see that the Saudi and Indian political relationship and defense relationship would expand, as India would potentially be part of this Cold War. It may not be firmly in the Western bloc, but our expectation is that it would not be in the pro-China bloc. And Saudi Arabia would be able to expand its relations with the subcontinent as part of that kind of containment of China strategy. So that's and of course, we consider this in the next 4 years, actually 3 years now, to be one of our less likely scenarios, although we can't rule it out with the developments in Ukraine, that there might be things like an alternative financial system or a bifurcating of the international order. At the moment, we simply don't see it as the most likely scenario. We see right now that the U.S. is deprioritizing the Middle East and Saudi Arabia as our most likely scenario. So I've talked a lot. I am more than happy to take any questions or hear some thoughts from anybody about what they might think about the approach or some of our scenarios that we built. So please, I'm going to turn off my sharing screen. And yes, if there's any questions, or I'm not sure. To make sure that I got myself correct technically here. Is that if there's no questions or any thoughts or any feedback, yeah. Okay, well, unless I've got a technical issue, if there's no questions or any discussion points, I'm not sure if anybody has thought about alternative scenarios that that perhaps our categories didn't fit into, or if they have any questions about the way that we are viewing or framing these scenarios. I just want to make sure that my technical side is that nobody's trying to speak and that I'm not muting anybody. Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, I know it's been a long day for some of you folks, so well, thank you so much. And I guess we will call it a morning or an afternoon or an evening, depending on where you are. And hopefully you can reach out to us at any time. All right.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, guys.